worst field trip I ever went on was a day that would also turn out to be one of the worst of my entire life. I went to high school on the North Shore of Staten Island, and round about that time of my junior year I started getting mad into CSI. Not just like, oh cool, I like this TV show. I mean, I wanted to be one of those guys. That show taught me that being a total nerd could be kinda cool. Everyone I know that was into the show had this super glamorous idea of what being a forensic investigator entailed, and for the longest time, I really wanted a part of that. Which is why I jumped at the chance to join my high school's forensic science club. We didn't do anything all that cool at first, just played around with fingerprint powder and did some pretty fun but pretty basic chemistry experiments. But I didn't join for that. I joined because the teacher in charge of the club had promised a field trip to the country's coroner's office, which would include a tour of the morgue. I didn't even know they gave tours of morgues, but I figured they have to run some kind of recruitment-based PR, right? So on the day in question, we all load onto one of the school buses and head off to the coroner's office. We'd been warned that we were going to be seeing some pretty graphic stuff, and despite having already collected permission slips, the teacher wanted to give us one more chance to back out while we still had the chance. We all just sat there all smug, and personally, wild horses couldn't have dragged me off that bus. But if we had any idea of what we'd be seeing in that morgue, if a glimpse into a crystal ball had shown us how that day was going to go down, not a single person would have remained on that bus, I guarantee it. Anyway, we get to the morgue, and obviously we don't get to the good stuff right away. We go through the day-to-day routine of a mortuary worker, what it's like for those on the lowest rung of the ladder. Then things get more complicated and we start getting to see some of the labs there, albeit through a toughened glass window, but I was still salivating over all their Gucci lab equipment. CSI made it look all high-tech for TV, but the real thing was somehow even more impressive, despite not being quite as glamorous. After the lab stuff, we took a quick lunch break in tandem with the mortuary team. The afternoon promised to bring all the more macabre stuff that the more ghoulish of us have been looking forward to, and you could definitely feel a few ripples of excitement running through us as we ate our pre-packed food. When we returned, the excitement was only ramped up when one of the staff gave us yet another warning concerning what we were about to see, because he was going to share some organ samples with us. From what I can remember, the way it works is this. Say you die in a pretty distinct way, like cancer attacks a specific organ. The medical examiner will sometimes remove this organ for preservation so they can continue to study the cause of death long after a person has been laid to rest. What that means is that the coroner has a storage space with literally hundreds of organ samples in it. I mean, it is wall-to-wall organs in there, some of which are in a pretty gnarly condition, and we were going to get a chance to look at every single one. At first, it was every bit as fascinating as I imagined it would be. Sure, it was morbid, and once or twice I had to remind myself that everything in there had once belonged to a living, breathing person. It also made me think how fragile we are as people, how there's so much that can go wrong with our bodies. Honestly, it's kind of a miracle we can even get out of bed in the morning. Then, right as I'm musing all that over, the gentle hum of whispering among the students was suddenly broken by a distinct, "Oh my God." It wasn't like a scream or a horrified OMG. It was more like a disgusted surprise, which is why I initially thought someone had just found a particularly gruesome specimen. But it was worse than that. Much, much worse. Another person yelled in disgust, only this time it really does sound horrified, and instantly I'm on my way to the source. Two girls are standing in front of a shelf full of specimens, staring in horror at one in particular. I couldn't quite make out which one, and the next thing I know, the girl who shouted this lets out the most blood-curdling scream and goes hurtling out of the room, followed by her friend. Before I can get a chance, other kids are crowding the area trying to work out which specimen had the girls freaked out. Slowly, they start to see it too, and the group starts buzzing with exclamations and chatter until our teacher demanded to know what was going on. The group goes silent before turning to look at our teacher. Then, as they slowly made space so the teacher could see what they were looking at, one of the kids pointed to the offending jar. It was a brain. just floating there in isopropyl or formalin or whatever they were using as a fluid preserve. It didn't look all that gross. Freaky, sure, but it didn't have any of the tumors or necrotic tissue that some of the others had. In fact, it actually looked relatively fresh compared to the others. But the issue wasn't so much the organ, but who it belonged to. See, the brain belonged to a kid who died in a car crash. The vehicle he was driving got plowed into an SUV coming the wrong way, and his little sister was in the car with him when it happened. She survived, thank God, but she had to watch her brother die, right in front of her eyes, before rescue could arrive to pull her out of the wreckage. The medical examiner put the cause of death as blunt force impact wounds to the head, hence why his brain was of interest. But this kid wasn't just some random kid. This kid went to our high school. The girl who ran out had been a close friend of his, and the crash was only 2 months before the field trip. She was only just getting over his death, only just becoming able to get out and socialize again. The forensics field trip had been the first big thing she'd been excited about since her friend's death. And then she shows up and finds his brain in a jar. It was like something out of a bad horror movie. I mean, people were just messed up. The girl who screamed went completely AWOL with her friend. I think her mom went to find her after talking with the teacher because the bus left without either of them. Everyone else was in a sorry state too. Most of the girls were crying. Heck, even some of the guys were too, kinda. I can't blame them though. It was an incredible thing to see. Incredibly terrifying, really. But it was knowing you can just end up as a brain on a shelf, a labeled specimen. That's what got me. I didn't really know the guy, but I knew he deserved better. Obviously, the incident caused a huge stink, and the kid's family said that they were even going to sue the county and school district. Rightfully so, if you asked me. But the trouble was, the guy was an organ donor. I mean, good for him for being unselfish about it, but that legally meant that after he was dead, his organs basically became property of the state. And at first, anyway, his family were told they weren't allowed to have their son's brain back. All they wanted to do was bury him again, and they had to get an emergency order signed by the governor or somebody so they could get him in one piece again. I can't imagine how horrible that must have been. Not one funeral for your dead son, but 2. The family weren't done litigating, though. They wanted to get paid. I don't even think they really wanted the money either, or rather, they didn't need it. I just think they wanted to bleed the state government for what they did. I mean, they didn't even tell his parents that they were going to harvest his brain, let alone put it on display for high school kids to look at in less than 10 weeks after his death. It took them a while to get the case to court, and I remember being happy for them that they might get a little justice. But then word swept around town that they didn't get a dime. Some judge said that the state were well within their right to cut that kid's brain out. Like, I'm sure it wasn't phrased like that, but whoever had the balls to tell a kid's parents, "So what if we butchered your boy? Suck it up." There's a special place in the dark recesses of the afterlife for that guy. Oh boy. That court thing was only a few years back, and that's why it became the worst day of my life. Because it wasn't just finding the jar or seeing people's reactions to it. It was the fallout. It was knowing that poor kid's parents were reliving the torture of losing their kid over and over again for like a decade straight. And that's the real nightmare here. Not just finding a brain in a jar. And knowing that just makes the world seem a little bleaker.
So as some background, my family live about a state away from me. And at the time that this happened, I had just turned 18 years old. And my mom would finally let me drive to go see them, which was about a 5.5-hour drive. No biggie. I was like, bet, I can smoke and drive that easily. And I did just that. About halfway there, I needed to stop to get some gas and get snacks. As you can guess, I had the munchies. I wasn't really familiar with the drive or where the gas stations were on the way there, and they were kind of spread out. So as soon as I felt like it wasn't smart to wait until I found another gas station, I pulled off the highway. I've always been sort of suspicious of people in general because I've not had an easy childhood. I grew up learning just to kind of feel when things are not right. So I wasn't really worried about being by myself because I knew how to handle myself. So I pull up to this relatively empty gas station, maybe one or two other cars, but it was a larger one with one of the antique shops in it. I parked at a pump, locked my doors, and go inside. There was no one at the counter yet, and there was a sign on the counter saying that they would be right back. So I just go and pick out a snack and a drink. Well, when I previously walked in, I noticed a man, late 20s, kind of just wandering around in the store. I saw him glance over at me when I walked inside, but didn't really think about it. Not really paying him any kind of attention, I went and opened the door to the soda when he comes right up next to me and opens the one next to mine. This wasn't particularly weird to me, but the fact that he was literally all the way across the store when I came in, and then as soon as I go over there, he does too, I was like, okay, I'm gonna go look for a different drink. So I go to the tea section and stand there for a sec, and he follows me to the one right next to me yet again. Only this time he looks at me, smiles a really creepy closed-lipped smile, and then says,
"Hi there."
I do also want to say that even though he could have easily just been trying to be nice or flirt or something, I had an instant creepy vibe from him when he first walked over, and that intuition has never failed me before. At this point, I just look at him, nod my head, then grab something and go to the counter, thinking to myself that I can just grab a snack later. He comes right up behind me with just one of those jerky sticks. Literally didn't grab even anything from the refrigerators that he was looking in right next to mine, and just stands super close to me. And I mean, he was literally right up behind me. I could feel his body heat and his breath on the back of my neck. I'm literally just waiting for this freaking cashier to hurry up and come in here so I can get the heck away from him. So I decide to start calling for someone. No one answers or comes out. The dude behind me is texting on his phone, and he's just looking around and at the door, like he's waiting for someone. Finally, I'm just like, screw it, I'm out of here. I leave my drink on the counter and walk out. He follows me. At this point, I literally run to my car, and I remember feeling him grasp my jacket, but with the momentum of my arm swinging, he wasn't able to get a firm hold on me. I hop in and lock the doors, turning my car in record speed. We make eye contact, and out of the corner of my eye, I can see two men run from around the corner of the gas station. All three of them run at my car, which is not very far from where the first guy is, and I just floor it out of there, almost nearly wrecking my car on the corner. I don't know what they were planning on doing, but I imagine I was about to get kidnapped. I called the police because I don't know where the cashier was, and I just had a really bad feeling that they did something to them. By the time the police got there, they were gone. I now always carry a knife on me whenever I go on that drive.
This story takes place in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. For those who are not aware, the Appalachian mountain range is approximately 480 million years old, and I've always wondered, while hiking in the park, about what kind of animals once roamed the hills we hike today. In the summertime, the dense vegetation and the abundant rhododendrons can take you back to a prehistoric age when the dinosaurs would have foraged among the same hills that hikers now casually walk, basking in the unparalleled beauty that is the Smokies. This event happened in late December, when the leaves fall off the deciduous trees, opening the hills to your eyes, allowing you to see the contours of the land as you hike. Me and my girlfriend were staying in the small town of Weir's Valley, which is approximately 45 minutes west of the bustling tourist trap of Gatlinburg. We'd stayed in Gatlinburg in years past and decided that this year we wanted a small cabin far from the normal hustle and bustle of the late December tourist rush. Many of the locals spitefully call this period from Christmas to New Year's Hell Week. Knowing this, we decided to stop at a small hiking store and inquired about a day hike that would take us far into the backcountry. They pulled out a map detailing the western end of the park and showed us multiple trails that would fit our description. We ended up settling on a trail that was about 4 miles one way, with a massive waterfall as the reward at the end of the trail. We arrived at the trailhead at about 9 in the morning, and there was only about one car there already. Perfect. It was an elderly couple getting their packs ready for their hike, and we were excited at the lack of hikers. As our goal for the day was to try and not see a human being for the entire hike, The first half of the hike was entirely uneventful. We reached the waterfall after about 2 hours or so, and sat down and took a lunch break before departing back towards the trailhead. Before I continue the story, I want to make a note that we had not seen a single person the entire hike so far. We had not even seen so much as a plane flying overhead. That's why we turned the corner on the trail and we froze in our places. There was a girl walking alone about 50 yards ahead of us. Now, normally it's not uncommon to see people hiking alone, but they typically look the part. They usually have a hiking pack, hiking shoes, and they'll almost always acknowledge you and ask you how your day is before you go in your separate ways. Not this girl. First and foremost, she did not look like she belonged out there. She looked like she was about 15 or 16 years old, and she did not have a bag or any wallet. She was about 15 or 16 wearing tennis shoes, which was odd considering that this rugged trail demanded heavy hiking boots. We were shocked to see her out this far by herself, and we were even more disturbed that we didn't see her before turning the corner on the trail. She essentially appeared out of nowhere. After me and my girlfriend exchanged concerned looks, we decided to continue down the trail as normal, as we didn't want this girl to turn around and see us just standing there and spook her. We made ourselves known as best as we could by kicking rocks with our boots and talking to each other. This girl didn't turn around and acknowledge us or even respond to us one time, even when we said hello. After about 50 yards of following her at a distance, we reached a creek crossing with a rudimentary path of dry rocks as the only way to cross. She put her arms out to balance herself, and we both noticed that when she put her arms up, it didn't look right. Unless you had terrible balance, there was no reason to balance yourself on this little creek crossing. Calling it a creek is almost giving it too much credit, as it was more like a gentle stream coming off the hill that crossed the trail and flowed to the river below. The water at its deepest was no more than 6 inches, and if you had halfway decent hiking boots, you could simply walk through the water without getting your feet wet. Wanting to be considerate of our fellow hiker, we decided to wait behind her as she arduously crossed the creek. She took way more time than she needed to cross, and it felt like she was deliberately walking slow to creep us out. We crossed the creek in about 30 seconds time after watching her take 2 or 3 minutes. Keep in mind, this creek was maybe 15 feet long at that, and as I mentioned, maybe 6 inches deep. I decided to cross before my girlfriend, because I had a nauseating feeling in the pit of my stomach about the entire situation, and I wanted to put something between her and my girlfriend. Because I had my eyes glued on this girl, I wasn't paying attention to where I was walking, and my foot slipped from the rock and fell into the water, making a very loud splash. Even though this girl was less than 20 feet ahead of us, she still did not turn around and acknowledge us. After me and my girlfriend crossed the creek, we could see that shortly ahead were a set of switchbacks going down the mountain. We decided to stop and put some distance between us and the girl. She was walking at an incredibly slow pace, and we waited for a couple of minutes before we saw that she had gone around the corner down the first switchback. Me and my girlfriend had a brief conversation about what the heck just happened, and we collected ourselves and continued down the trail. We didn't think anything much of it, we just tried to continue going without being unnerved any further. We thought that was the case, and so when we turned down the first switchback and saw something terrible, well, we saw nothing at all. The girl had vanished, unless she took off at a sprint as soon as she turned the corner. We should have seen her. The switchback was very gradual, and we could clearly see the next 5 or 6 switchbacks below us. The leaves were gone off the trees, allowing us to see every foot of the trail below. Even if she started running, we would have heard her. The main river was about 500 feet below us, and the rushing water was barely audible from where we were standing. She either vanished, hid behind a tree from us, or somehow managed to sprint a quarter-mile down the mountain in complete silence away from us. We had absolutely no idea what to think, so we once again stopped to collect ourselves. We were terrified and were not sure whether to go back up the mountain or continue down as planned. After a hurried deliberation, we decided to proceed down the trail as normal. We never saw her. As we reached the trailhead, we ran into a group of hikers, and we figured we'd ask them if they saw a teenage girl hiking along without a backpack, They gave us a strange look and said we were the first people they'd seen on the trail all day. We simply thanked them and continued, as to not scare them. I've always heard of paranormal things happening in the Smokies, from Bigfoot to skinwalkers to a group of wild mountain people living primitively within the park. I've always entertained these stories because who doesn't love a good ghost story? I've never anticipated having an encounter of my own in the woods. The scariest thing to me about the encounter all these years later, though, is that we never saw her face.
Paid a few more dollars than any other job I could land, so I figured why not. I remember landing a construction job a year into working this night shift security job. I enjoyed construction a lot more, and I desperately needed to get my life back on track. Being on night shift really messed with my mood and general well-being. The construction job I got had roughly the same pay, so it was a no-brainer even if I had to do a little bit more manual labor. As much as I disliked the job itself, I really liked all the people that worked at that museum. They were actually really cool. I went ahead and gave them my 2 weeks' notice and told them that I would stick around for as long as they needed me to find a replacement. They hired some skinny pale guy named Justin. When I first met him, he seemed like he was a decent enough guy. After all, it really wasn't my problem once I left. After a couple of shifts with him, though, I noticed that he was an extremely awkward and very strange person. He did this thing where he would change the tone of his voice mid-sentence. It was really strange, and it almost made me feel like he had some kind of mental issue. Trust me, I wasn't being judgmental or anything, and if you heard it yourself, you would probably have had the same concern. Not that I thought that he was dangerous or anything, just a little out there with a possible mental illness, maybe even a speech impediment. But anyway, it was my 3rd or 4th shift training him, and it was an ordinary night just like any other. As weird as he may have been, he seemed somewhat depressed or sad. I caught on pretty easily as he didn't make much of an effort to conceal it. We were making the usual trip throughout the entire museum, which was honestly a pretty long walk. We were probably about 10 minutes into it when I finally just asked him why he seemed so sad. He told me that he was really lonely and couldn't get a girlfriend. Again, if you had one look at this guy, you would probably understand why he couldn't get a girlfriend, let alone his weird personality. I tried telling him that there were plenty of fish in the sea and that he could probably have some luck on the internet. Online dating wasn't as big back then, though. He kind of shrugged his shoulders and just continued being sad. Whatever. I didn't know what else I could tell him. After that point, it became gradually weirder and weirder with each passing night. It was really strange. For instance, he would start going on these massive monologues about the most random things in the world. I only had to stay for a couple more shifts, but it honestly became really intolerable being around this guy. There was one night where he talked for at least 15 entire minutes about the environmental harm of pizza crust. Yes, literally pizza crust. It made absolutely no sense in the world. I tried interrupting him a couple of times to ask what was up, but he just cut me off and even started ignoring me after a certain point. When you are completely alone in a massive building with one other person, trust me when I say that their mental well-being is very important. I gradually began feeling more and more unsafe in the presence of this weird guy. Justin just seemed like he was going crazy or something. Thankfully, my entire shift with him went by decently enough. It was still awkward and moderately unbearable, but it was at least over. I started my new job and everything seemed to be going really well. I had completely forgotten about Justin and life seemed to move on. I didn't really think about that security job anymore at all. That was until I heard about an interesting story from my friend a few months later. I still kept in touch with a few people from the museum that worked there during the day. We were only Facebook friends, but that was enough for me. One of them messaged me to ask me what I thought about that guy Justin that replaced me. I was honest with her and told her that I thought Justin was really strange and possibly insane or something. And she typed back, "You're going to love this then." She then proceeded to tell me about Justin being fired for completely destroying an entire exhibit on night shift. I guess they came in at the morning shift and found him trying to put it back together. They watched the security footage and this guy literally tried to fight a dinosaur skeleton. I guess he had been acting really weird that night, judging by what she had told me about the rest of the security footage. But the interesting part of the story is that they somehow found out he was on antipsychotic medication. They figured that he probably had stopped taking his medication. That was all my friend knew, and that's all I know. It's really scary how people can stop taking their very necessary medication on a whim, and then potentially have a complete mental breakdown. I started wondering if he had been off his meds when I first met him. All I know is that I'm kinda happy I don't ever have to see Justin again.
We've lived in our neighborhood for nearly 4 years. A few houses down and across the street is a Filipino family. They're pretty nice, and whenever we see each other, we always have small talk, and we know each other by name. We moved in right before I gave birth to my oldest, so they always ask for the baby, and they love seeing them. We have even had meals at each other's homes before. This summer, they had an older family member, maybe 55 to 60 years old, come to visit. We noticed him right away because he would always go for long walks and lingered a lot. One evening, the mother of the family introduced him as her father. He had recently moved and would be staying with them for a while before heading north to her sister's house. He was pretty new to the US and spoke a little English, just enough to get by. He seemed nice enough, but as soon as we walked inside, I told my husband that he gave me a really weird vibe. I had never felt that way of any of the 7 other family members from the home. I've been in their home and shared meals with them. They're very sweet and welcoming. My husband also told me that he did seem a little off, but we just chalked it up to cultural differences. Fast forward about a month. My mother-in-law and my mother came to visit at the very same time. They're in the driveway with our son. I run inside because I'm pregnant and I suffer from severe morning sickness. I come back out 15 minutes later and they're having a frustrating conversation with this man. He was trying to get one of them to drive him to the store, and he would use a food stamp/EBD card to buy their groceries and wanted them to give him cash. They both told him that they weren't interested, but he just kept asking and lingering. When I went outside, I called out to my husband to come out, and when he saw us, he walked away very quickly. Both of our mothers told us what had happened and how forceful that he was being with them. The next few days that I see him walking, we always wave and say simple pleasantries, but every time I would wave, he would take it as a sign to come over and try to have a conversation. I began to let him know that what he did with our mothers is very illegal, and to be so forceful was really unnecessary. He said that he understood, but he would linger. It would always be at a moment where I was trying to strap my toddler to his car seat and I was rushing to get him to school. It would always take me about 10 minutes to get him to get the hint that I couldn't talk, and he would slowly walk away and just linger in our driveway. It eventually got to the point where I would watch to see if he had walked past our house on his morning walk before venturing outside. I really just hated the awkward conversation. He would always seem to round the corner just as I finished strapping my son in the car and I was getting in. I would wave and then jump in quickly and drive off. It just felt really off, like he was waiting for me. One of our neighbors across the street one night told me that she got a weird vibe from him as well. And again, he always lingered. She told me that he did similar things with her when they were outside as well. They were opting to hang in the backyard with the kids just to avoid it altogether. Now, I usually work from home, but one day I went into the office and I was then alerted by the Ring camera. This man was standing and looking in through our kitchen window, just peering, and I could hear our pit bull barking at him. When he saw our dog, he jumped back and I used the microphone to say, "Can I help you? What do you want?" He looked absolutely shocked and then scurried away. I called my husband and I told him to play the video. We both thought it was really creepy. Whenever we saw the family walking that evening, we decided to bring it up to his daughter. She spoke to her father and he claimed that it never happened. We then showed her the video on her phone, and he said that he must have gotten lost. The daughter seemed pretty annoyed by him and the entire situation, so him being weird kinda calmed down a bit after that. I could see that his daughter was really annoyed by his behavior, and as they were walking, there was a really heated conversation. She later told me that he tends to be overly friendly and he really means no harm, but she talked to him and he would leave us alone. I asked if he had some kind of mental issue or maybe Alzheimer's since he was always getting lost. She told me no, and that he had always acted like that and that she couldn't wait until his sister was ready for him to be sent up north to her. There were a few other neighbors that had also complained to her and the homeowners association as well. Well, about 2 months later, I dropped my son off to preschool. I get home and I have to rush in because I feel really sick. Usually I leave my car door open, but something told me to lock it as soon as I got out. I did so as I was rushing inside. I would also normally leave the door unlocked if I was just going for a quick throw-up session, but again, my instincts told me to lock the bottom and top lock. When I was in the bathroom, right by the front door throwing up my life, I then hear a rattling at the front door. Someone is turning the lock back and forth. Of course, my ring chimes and I then look at it in between heaves. What do you know? It's the old man and he's trying to get into our home. I go over to the microphone and then say, "You're at the wrong house." To which he responds with,
Let me in, now. I want to tell you something.
Now, I kid you not, it was the best English sentence I had ever heard from someone who wasn't that good with English. I started to feel better pretty quickly and I was now on high alert. I responded with, "What do you want to tell me?" He looked right at the camera.
Let me in your house, now!
This is where I started to panic. He knew he was at the wrong house, but still he was continuing to try and break in. I respond, "Please get off my property. I don't feel comfortable with you here and I'm not letting you in my house." He then starts rattling at the door again really hard and tries to pull it open and then starts knocking on the bathroom window. This is where I get pissed. "Get the hell off my damn property right now. I'm not gonna let you in. If you don't get the hell out of here right now, I'm calling the cops." He then steps back, gives the camera the middle finger, and scurries off. He disappears and I run upstairs and see that he's simply walking back to his house. I let our pit bull out of our bedroom as he had been going crazy during this whole ordeal. I call my husband and he tells me to call the daughter and tell her what happened. I call her and I tell her what happened and she told me not to let him in, ever. She began to warn me that he's been very inappropriate and forceful with all of the women in her family, and she didn't want me to get hurt, especially being pregnant. She eventually comes over about an hour later and I show her the video. She's absolutely fuming over this and very apologetic, and she begs me not to call the cops. She promises me he'll be gone within the next day. The next day, he eventually flies out and his daughter told him that he's no longer welcome in her home. He now lives up north somewhere in Maryland with his other daughter and probably harassing other people as well. I honestly really don't know what would have happened if I didn't follow my instincts that day. I'm just really glad I'm okay.
I'm a college student in my second year at university. Overall, it's pretty nice. Freedom is pretty cool, if you call having a curfew and strict dorm regulations freedom. Anyways, my grades are decent, and there is a few attractive guys in my class. However, currently, I'm sort of stuck, as my entire campus is on lockdown. The text to alert students of the lockdown came around 8 o'clock this morning, and we haven't heard a word since. I room with 2 other girls, a hyper redhead named Allie, and a girl from Africa named Samantha. Both of them are nice enough, and we all get along well. At first, the 3 of us just assumed it was a drill. They have those occasionally. That they just wanted to ensure that everything was okay, and that the emergency alarm system was working properly, and that students know how to respond. However, those tend to stop pretty quickly. It's been hours. Not to mention the yelling we heard at the beginning. though it could have just been the initial panic. It ended up stopping about an hour into the lockdown, though it did scare the daylights out of Samantha. Before anyone questions our safety precautions, we have the blinds down and the doors locked. There's a very small wooden chair shoved under the handle, though I doubt that would do much. Sam and Allie attempted to push the dresser from the bedroom to the door. According to protocol, we're supposed to barricade all possible exits. But the doorway is so small that we can't fit the damn thing in there. Figures that the college board, being a bunch of cheapskates, will cost us our lives. I always joke about it, them being so cheap, but I didn't really think it would actually become a problem in the future. I know I may be overreacting, but are lockdowns really supposed to last this long? Internet and cell service keeps cutting in and out. It's so hard to contact the people in the other dorms. Though Samantha managed to get a hold of her mom briefly, she wasn't aware of the lockdown. She said there wasn't anything on the news. I guess that rules out school shooter, because reporters always end up on site as it's happening. I figured posting this here would at least give me something to focus on. Allie and Sam are talking about checking out around the hallways. Maybe we can find some students who actually know what's going on. My college is a pretty decent size, so it shouldn't be that hard to find someone. I figure if we don't hear anything in the next couple of hours, we should look around. It may have just been a false alarm. Either way, I'll be sure to make an update as soon as I know what's going on. Last night at around 9, Samantha decided that she had enough. Allie and I chickened out, so we stayed here. Sam said that she would be right back. She was going to try to find someone and figure out what's going on, but she hasn't come back. Neither Allie nor I have heard anything. It looks like there are a few posts on social media from other confused students, but all of them are in the same situation we are. There was a brief talk about meeting up, but if Sam didn't come back, I don't know what to think about that. We've also tried to call the police, but they keep hanging up on us. I really don't know what to do. It's been a hectic week. Last time I updated this, Samantha had just left, and it was mostly quiet. After I attempted to call the police, Allie and I spent most of the night studying. Exams are important, and it gave us something to do while we waited. I guess I passed out sometime the night before, because I woke up to the sound of police sirens outside. There was blood. Everywhere. I mean everywhere. On the floor, the walls, and even on the ceiling of the hallways. After the police escorted the remaining students out of their dorms, most of them just went home. My school isn't a very large one, so we all lost at least one person. No one knows where the missing are. The officer said that they try to keep situations like this out of the public eye. God only knows what that means. If your college starts giving an alarm, don't brush it off. Barricade yourself immediately. And if someone knows what happened to Samantha, please tell me.
Back when my daughter was just 11 years old, I got a call from one of her teachers while I was at work. It was the first time I'd ever gotten a call from them, as my wife dealt with all the school stuff while I focused on my building firm. So when the teacher mentioned something about my daughter being on a school trip, I had to interrupt her to tell her I barely knew anything about it. I know that seems rude, but I was in the middle of dealing with a customer, and time is money, as they say. The teacher then tells me that my wife isn't answering her phone, but that something very, very serious has happened. Like she'd already mentioned, my daughter had gone on a field trip that morning with the rest of her year's group. She had been accounted for in the morning, but following another roll call after their lunch break, she was nowhere to be found. Obviously, I'm already furiously anxious at that point, but I'm managing to keep it together, right up until I ask where my daughter is lost. Knowsley Safari Park, the teacher responded. I literally couldn't believe my ears. Like I actually had to ask her again just to be sure of what she'd said. When she confirmed it, my legs turned to jelly. Knowsley Safari Park has all kinds of wild animals that can just wander right up to cars. If my daughter had somehow just gotten up out of her seat whilst inside the safari park, there's no telling what kind of danger she was in. It was honestly one of the worst days of my life. All I could think about was getting the call that They'd found her body and the closed casket funeral she'd have to receive. It'd be in the papers, no doubt. Every parent's worst nightmare, I'd say. A national scandal, they'd make the grieving process infinitely more painful. Obviously, I got in touch with my wife about it before her teachers managed to, actually, and she was every bit as distraught as you can imagine. Of all the places for your kid to get lost, a place where lions are allowed to roam freely on some old country estate or something. The wife was in work at the time and was so upset that she was sent home. She called up our daughter's school just to make sure she wasn't there, but there was no sign of her. Obviously, they'd pretty much confirmed in our heads that she was gone, and we'd be the next set of parents to be crying on the nightly news, begging people to come forward. I was just numb with terror, and even with all my workaholic tendencies, I couldn't find my focus. So I decided to drive home and meet my wife at the house to make sure she wasn't too hysterical. She really had taken it badly on the phone, and I was almost as worried about her as I was my daughter. Then, as I'm driving home, I see my phone in the driver's seat next to me start lighting up and buzzing. This is before I had a car with a Bluetooth stereo, and there was a police car like 3 cars behind, so I didn't fancy getting pulled over in the middle of getting the worst news of my life. The wife kept calling too, over and over again, and I just had this horrible sinking feeling that she'd gotten the word that our worst fears had been realized. So again, I keep it together, focusing on getting home in one piece, but then I pulled into our driveway, and I see that the door to our house is slightly ajar. I don't know what it was about that little indicator, but it put the fear of God into me. Was my wife so upset she hadn't shut the door? Had the police just walked in after telling her our daughter was dead? It all sounds quite irrational, I know, but I was in a terrible state at the time, and that's all I could put it down to. So instead of actually getting out the car and going inside to check on her, I called the wife from my driver's seat. I felt like a condemned man being walked the gallows as I waited for her to answer, and when she did, she was floods of tears. I mean floods. And I knew the worst had come. I just needed to hear her say it. But instead, all she said was, "She's here. She's at home. And thank God she's fine." I practically fell out of the car seat and bolted into the house. There, in the living room, are my wife and my daughter, both with tear-stained cheeks. And I'll tell you what, I'd be lying if I said my eyes didn't get a bit leaky in the moments that followed. Now I bet you're all wondering what exactly happened and how she ended up back at home, and not at school or at the safari park. So, my daughter had just started secondary school here in the UK, and the safari park trip was supposed to be something of a social occasion in which kids could get to know each other while setting a positive atmosphere for the year ahead. But as it turned out, after the morning registration, my daughter and her friends had something of a falling out, and right before they were due to get on the coach, someone said something very mean to her. So instead of following her friends onto the coach, our daughter just slipped away without anyone noticing. She said she spent about half an hour or so in the library, but was so upset that she decided to just walk home. Having known about the spare back door key we keep under a plant pot in the backyard, she was able to let herself into the house. Then right about the same time she's making herself beans on toast to cheer herself up, her teachers do their second head count of the day, and that's when the whole saga kicked off. It was most definitely one of the worst experiences of my entire life. I know she was okay in the end, but I can't understate the terror you feel as a parent, knowing your child is either missing or in danger. I mean, it's completely irrational. I'd like to think I'm quite a patient and understanding person. You have to be in the building trade. But the teacher told me my daughter was lost. I actually wanted to murder her. The morning of September 23rd, 1904 was marked by gray, ominous clouds that blanketed the skies of Cincinnati, Ohio. And it was raining at around 10:15 a.m. when the principal of Pleasant Ridge School, Thomas L. Zimmerman, rang the bell for morning recess. Zimmerman figured a little rain wouldn't do the children any harm, as they scattered into groups and began games of baseball and partook in general tomfoolery. But the principal had seriously misjudged how fast and how strong the rain would come. And not just the rain either. A full-on storm was quickly approaching. A few minutes later, the wind picked up while a heavy rain began to fall on the schoolyard. Most of the children ran for the school building to save themselves from being soaked through, but a group of about 30 young girls made a break for the outhouse on the opposite side of the schoolyard. The outhouse was a 10-foot square framed building positioned over a 12-foot deep stone vault on the eastern side of the schoolyard. It was only 11 years old, but had to be repaired several times because of shoddy construction. It was designed for maybe only a handful of students at any one time, but on that day, just over 30 young girls were trying to squeeze into the cramped, dank space. Suddenly, and without warning, the floor on one side of the building, rotten from years of moisture, gave way, and the entire floor of the privy crashed to the bottom of the vault, taking all 30 or so of the terrified young women with it. The floor fell almost 8 feet vertically and completely shattered, sending children as young as 7 into a huge pool of sewage water that was around 4 feet deep. There was no crash at all, 12-year-old Elsie Ferguson later said. There was no noise whatsoever, the floor just fell. That's all there was to it. Not a child screamed that I'd heard. I felt the floor going and jumped quickly, clutching to the side of the door. I was left hanging on it, and with all my strength I pulled myself up and out of that place. A handful of the other girls managed to escape the same way, climbing up onto the toilet seat to make room for the others before making it to a doorway. But not all were so fortunate. Raw panic ensued, and the tragic accident quickly became a battle for their lives. The girls were unwittingly pitted against each other in a struggle for survival as they tried to climb out of the 4-foot deep pool of human excrement, with the weaker girls crushed down by the stronger peers as they were forced under to drown in the mass of filth. You see, a mass drowning is perhaps one of the darkest, most horrifying things a person can experience, because during a panic like that, survival mechanics in the human brain kick in, and a person will find any kind of leverage at all to stay above water. This means that people will literally drag each other underwater, climbing atop each other's drowning bodies in order to stay afloat and breathing air. And this is exactly what happened during the tragedy that day. Girls were actually drowning each other in a desperate bid to stay alive. A young woman by the name of Lorena Ferguson was rushing into the outhouse just moments after the floor gave way, stopping dead in her tracks when she saw the horrific scene below. Seconds later, she turned on her heels and ran back into the schoolhouse to fetch help. A few minutes later, 2 of the girls ran into the room and exclaimed that a girl had fallen into the vault. Principal Zimmerman later told a local newspaper, "I didn't realize the awful calamity that had overcome us, but hurried in the direction of the outbuilding. On the way, I met a number of others. They were screaming wildly at the top of their voices, and it was some time before one of them could compose herself sufficiently to explain what had happened. Another young woman ran to one of the high school classrooms, which was still in session, and alerted one of the teachers there of the outhouse's collapse. And then she and 4 high school boys bolted toward the outhouse, arriving at roughly the same time as Principal Zimmerman, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover. The sight of terrified young women scrambling up the walls of the collapsed outhouse, covered in human filth, was almost too much to bear. Others further down were literally swimming in week-old fecal matter, struggling to keep their head above the mass of excrement. The sight alone was bad enough, but the cacophony of screams was almost deafening. All of the girls were screeching at the top of their lungs, their cries intermittent with the sounds of gagging and retching. 2 young men were across the street in the Presbyterian church with a few others when they heard the terrified screeching of the girls running away from the outhouse in the pouring rain. As they exited the church to see what all the commotion was about, they began to hear the faint screams of the girls trapped in the vault beneath the outhouse. They heard the desperate screams of "Mama, Papa, help us." Then, without as much as a word between them, the occupants of the church ran out into the rain and over to the girls' outhouse. There they found Principal Zimmerman, standing in a narrow doorway to the outhouse, looking half mad with anguish, pale with panic and unsure what to do. The men shoved him aside and got to work. They began calling out to any nearby to fetch ropes and ladders, anything that could help them fish the girls out from the pile of human waste. Zimmerman himself dropped to the ground near the open doorway, trying as best he could to reach some of the girls with just his arm, but it was impossible. They were way out of reach. Then some of the men who ran to help grabbed him by the legs and lowered him further down into the recess. This helped him rescue 3 of the girls before any rescue equipment even arrived, and probably saved the man a lifetime of guilt in the process, given that he had panicked so awfully in the initial stages of the rescue attempt. Especially given that the step ladders brought over for the school were far too short, and the ropes brought over were nothing but clotheslines which snapped uselessly as the girls attempted to climb up them. While I was waiting for a longer ladder, Zimmerman later said, I begged the children to be quiet and brave, and I would rescue them. Some of the older girls followed his commands, attempted to calm the younger ones, but it was no good. Panic had well and truly taken hold. The ladders and clotheslines repeatedly failed, and the rescuers were forced to rethink their strategy. Using quick thinking, one of the men climbed into the steeple of the nearby church and unfurled the rope off the church bell. This was much more effective a tool and helped save the lives of 2 more of the girls. Another one of the rescuers found a long ladder in a nearby barn and helped Principal Zimmerman dip it into the muck. It was not long enough to reach all the way from the bottom of the vault, but it was long enough for Zimmerman and some of the other men to descend and lift the girls out of the mess. The girls that were pulled out of the mess were almost unrecognizable. Their eyes clenched tightly shut as they wept hysterically, gasping for breath and trying to uselessly clean the stinking waste off themselves. The struggle down there was terrible, said a survivor named Hazel Senior, in the aftermath of the disaster. As long as I could get out of the water and take a breath of air, I felt sure of being saved, but when I fell back into the hole, I thought it was over. The girls about me were grabbing onto me. Everyone grabbed at each other, and when we did get a hold on the wall, it was only for a second. I caught hold several times, but when I was pulled at by the others, my hand slipped. There was only a few taken out when I felt something under my feet. It must have been some little girl that had drowned. All the time I prayed. I said my prayers over and over. I could not see after a while, and as I was praying to the Lord to save me, I found the rake in my hands. When I came into the light, I saw Principal Zimmerman. I crawled up and was lifted out. After struggling in the violent frenzy among the pit of disgusting fecal matter, 14-year-old Edna Gerke again found a purchase among the brickwork and made one final attempt to pull herself out. Far above me, it seemed somebody was coming down a ladder and called to me. Suddenly someone took hold of me. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the agonized faces of my friends, then lost consciousness and knew no more until I woke up in the schoolroom, surrounded by the bodies of my friends. Gerke's arms were horribly bruised and torn up by deep scratches. Wounds, she said, were down to the clawing attempts of her classmates to climb over her out of the stinking mess of filth. The rainstorm ceased not long after, but the break in the weather did little to relieve the chaos that was unfolding on the schoolyard. A fair few of the girls passed out not long after emerging from the sewage, adding the fear that they had succumbed to the terrible fumes of the cesspit they had fallen into. But thankfully, neighbors of the school offered up their homes as treatment centers, with rescuers carrying girls to the safety of houses where they were revived, cleaned up, and comforted after such a harrowing ordeal. After Zimmerman helped the 19th and final girl off the ladder and watched other rescuers carry her away into the schoolhouse for treatment, he leaned inside the shattered outhouse and peered into the dark, silent cesspit. All he could see were broken pieces of outhouse floor floating around in the surface of the foul water. As he realized the task was over and the adrenaline began to fade, he could have easily fallen into the cesspit himself if it wasn't for other rescuers coming to check on him. But then it was early afternoon, and the sun had finally broken through the clouds, shedding an oddly warm light on such a horrific scene of chaos, filth, and death. The gathered mass of onlookers and rescuers doubled as relatives began streaming in from downtown Cincinnati. It had taken only an hour or so for word-of-mouth accounts of the fatal collapse to reach the wider citizenry. When they heard the news, Pleasant Ridge residents who happened to be working downtown ran back to the village, where they were met with the sight of the frantic children and mothers of the victims, who were congregated in the front of the school. Many of the girls were vomiting blood, and a local doctor in attendance was not sure if they would survive the afternoon. Frantic confusion continued for several more hours as more and more people arrived from nearby villages, although most of the girls who crammed into the privy lived in Pleasant Ridge. The routes between the school and the train stations were crammed with people. The village telephone system proved inadequate to keep up with the demand, and hundreds of people crowded around every available phone, waiting to find if their daughter was among those affected. When the adrenaline rush of the rescue abated, Principal Zimmerman and his teachers sobbed along with the parents who lost their daughters. Local medical staff looked at the exhausted and emotionally distraught principal and ordered him to a house across the street to rest. One of the doctors remained there the remainder of the afternoon, suffering from a severe headache brought on by the tension and the hours he spent inhaling the noxious fumes emitted from the caked bodies of the drowned girls. On the Sunday morning of the drowned girls' funeral, every church bell in Pleasant Ridge rang continuously from 9 a.m. when the first funeral started until 4 p.m. when the last of the 4 girls buried that day were put to rest. 4 school friends of Emma Steinkamp, the first victim to be buried, had been tapped to be her pallbearers. The girls were bearing flowers dressed in white as they walked alongside, but after carrying the tiny casket to the front of the German Evangelical Church, they were too grief-stricken to carry on any further, so 4 local boys took over instead. The reverend of the Methodist Church tried to calm the sobbing crowd, but one grandmother fell weeping against the small casket, and Emma's mother fainted with a deafening shriek. At that point, 2 of the girls in white became hysterical and their parents carried them from the scene. The entire town and a fair portion of the rest of Cincinnati followed the hearse to the cemetery. It had been the most horrifying, revolting tragedy in the entirety of Cincinnati's recent history, one that the townsfolk would never forget, and the deaths were made all the more terrible by the fact that they had occurred in a pit of human sewage, a fate that no single person could ever deserve, let alone an innocent young girl.
I am a pizza delivery driver. This was by far the scariest thing to happen to me. It took place about 1 year ago. I was working on a Thursday night, which were usually decently busy. I made quite a few deliveries, and the later it got, the more things calmed down. At about 1 in the morning, I got a delivery for a cheese pizza. I put it into my car and drove to the location, which was about 10 minutes away. It was in an area of town which I rarely delivered to and was a little more run down. I got to the address, which was a 2-story house with a pretty decent-sized yard and many overgrown plants and trees. It looked a little bit run down like most houses in the area and had a front porch that seemed to wrap around the house. I got out of my car, grabbed the pizza, and walked up the driveway to the house. Then I walked up the steps to the door and rang the doorbell. About 30 seconds went by, and I was about to ring the bell again when the door started to open. A man answered. He was fairly large and bald and looked to be in his 50s. He just stood there staring at me for a second. I said I had his pizza and handed it to him. He looked almost surprised and said, "Oh, okay, that's nice." Then he just looked around. He just seemed a little bit strange to me. Then he said to me that he had to get some cash to tip me and he would be right back. He went back inside and closed the door. I stood there waiting for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but the man still didn't return. I was thinking about just leaving when I heard some noise and figured the man must be coming back. But when I listened closer, It wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from outside on the porch. I looked around to the direction of the noise. Then I saw from the side of the house on the porch 3 men approaching me about 30 feet away. I guess it was just an instinct, but as soon as I saw them, I turned and sprinted back down the porch to the driveway. When I did, I heard all the men start to chase after me. I ran as fast as I could to my car and unlocked it and then jumped inside. I frantically started the engine and stepped on the gas. As soon as my car started moving forwards, the men reached me. I felt one of them kick my back door and another one tried opening the door on the other side, but I was just barely able to drive away. I sped out of the neighborhood and all the way back to the pizza place. I have to think that the pizza delivery was some sort of trap to lure me into getting robbed, or maybe even worse. I haven't delivered to that area much since, but when I do, I'm extra careful. I recently moved across the country to a new town to go to school. I was able to land a job as a pizza delivery driver pretty easily. I've done this job before, and I like it because it's relatively easy and I make good money on tips. I work a lot of really late night shifts. A couple of weeks ago, I was working and at about 2 a.m. an order came in. It was for a large cheese pizza. At that hour, it was just a couple of us working, so I made the pizza myself and then put it in my car and went to deliver it. I didn't know the area very well, so I would always put the address in on my phone and then just follow the directions. I got in my car and typed it in. It said it was a 15-minute drive. As I drove, it seemed to be taking me into the middle of nowhere. I drove for about 10 minutes through woods with not a building or house in sight. Then finally, I was supposed to turn onto a little dirt road that I could barely see. If it hadn't showed up on my map, I would have almost certainly missed it. I slowed down and then turned onto the little dirt road. The map showed me continuing on this road for about 1 more mile, and then I would take a left, and the destination would be there. I began driving down the dirt road, which was surrounded by woods. Then suddenly, my phone lost signal. I wasn't all that surprised being so far out from the city, but I was concerned because I needed to find the house to deliver the pizza. I kept driving very slowly and looked for a road on the left side. Finally, I saw it and I turned. The road was another dirt one, but the woods on each side was even more dense. It was very eerie being out there on that road at that time of night, especially not knowing where I was. I drove down the road very slowly, looking on both sides for a house or some kind of building for whoever ordered a pizza out here. But all I saw was trees from the dense woods and some grass. I still had no service at all on my phone, but I knew I had to be close to where the delivery was supposed to be. It was very dark and hard to see, with the only lights coming from my headlights. I wasn't seeing any kind of buildings at all. I started to get a really creepy feeling being out there, and after about 5 minutes of driving down that road looking, I decided to turn around and go back, because I could clearly see that there was no buildings. I drove my car back to the other dirt road, and then back to where I had signal before. At last I was finally able to get connection on my phone, and when I did, I looked at the map again, but the address had been erased and it was not there. I found the card that I had wrote the address on and put it back into my phone, but this time it said address not found. I decided I would just head back and try to figure out what was going on. When I got back to the store, I showed my boss the address and told him what happened. He looked surprised when I gave him this information. Then he told me that there are no houses or buildings in that area at all. I went back to look at the order that had come in, but it was gone. I chalked it up to a lack of sleep, but to this day, I really don't know how to explain what happened. Maybe I was just really tired, but it was still a really creepy experience.
So, about a year ago, my apartment complex decided that they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver and my rent is pretty ridiculous here, so I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I really love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in the area. I immediately got a message from someone named Joe who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent pretty soon, and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with the owner. I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures that his neighbor took because the chat function on the app is really slow. I now feel really stupid for doing this, but eventually gave him my phone number. I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. Now, I normally don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone, so I answered it. I was completely bewildered when the person then said,
"Hi, it's Joe. How's your day going?"
Huh? It really took me by surprise, and I didn't really know what to say. He started to just shoot the crap on the phone, talking about how he works nights and how tired he is and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day. I finally interrupted and then said, "So, about the condo?" He pretty much completely disregarded that and then said,
"I really don't think that my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?"
I said that I have to go and then immediately hung up the phone. And as soon as I did, he then started texting me. It was really bizarre and quite alarming to me. I blocked his number, and then moments later, he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. Now, I'm 32 years old, but it was really creepy to me, and I even called my parents to tell them about it and just how unnerved that it made me. And the worst part about it is that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. So, I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible in my profile, but I checked, and sure enough, my address and unit number were totally public. Unable to really contact me in any other way, he started messaging me again on Nextdoor, asking me if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't really block or report people on the app, so I just decided to delete it. So, one night about a month or so later, I had a knock on my door at around 10 p.m. on a weeknight. I looked out my peephole but couldn't really get a good look. I saw that it was a man who slightly had his head down. Either way, I don't answer the door for anyone that I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 o'clock at night. Feeling panicked, I decided to call my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman and we always look out for each other since we both live alone. I asked her if it looked like he was some kind of delivery guy at the wrong door. She opened her door to try and get a good look at the guy, and that spooked him because he literally ran away. I honestly have no idea if this was the Nextdoor guy or not, but my gut tells me that it was. This was a big wake-up call. I always felt that I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know that my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be that casual or lazy about privacy settings like that ever again.
Growing up in a small town in Colorado, there weren't a ton of options for work as a 19-year-old who didn't go to college. So when I got my license, I ended up grabbing a job for one of the local diners that I used to love eating at. They had a delivery position, and I also bussed tables when there were no orders to be delivered. The radius for delivery wasn't too large, only about 3.5 miles. What happened was that the diner got a delivery order, and right away I recognized the address. It was one of our regulars, and after their food was made, it would only be a 15-minute drive for me. When I got in my car, I didn't even have to use the GPS because I knew the exact house I was going to. It was a small, single-story house that was in the middle of the woods. I loved this house's long gravel driveway. I would always see small critters like squirrels and other animals running through the trees and along the stone wall that lined the path. The driveway would then open up to an area that had room for about 4 cars to park in, which I love because they only ever had 1 car in the driveway, so I had enough space to simply turn around instead of having to reverse and make a K-turn. As I made my way down the driveway that evening, I was surprised that I didn't see any animals scurrying around, but I figured since it's getting cold again, it was just that time of year. So I drove all the way down the driveway and pulled in front of the house. As I got out of the car, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was staring at me. I just brushed it off as the owner looking out of their window, though, and continued around my car to the passenger side to get the food. As I'm leaning into the passenger side of the car, I heard the sound of something moving around behind me. I stood up straight and quickly turned to see what it was, but there was nothing there. I shrugged and continued to get the food out of my car. This time, though, as I was closing the passenger door, I heard what was an unmistakable, deep, growling noise coming from the trees. I tried my best to look into the dark forest where the noise was coming from. As I slowly backed toward the house, that was when I saw it. A medium-sized black bear came running out of the woods. I could hear the snarling coming from it with each step it took. I turned and sprinted toward the house. And when I reached the steps, I didn't waste time knocking. I grabbed the handle and thankfully, the door was unlocked so I was able to rush inside. I apologized to the homeowners for barging in like that, but once they looked out their window, they understood. To this day, I still don't think that bear was trying to attack me. If it wanted to get me, it was more than fast enough. If I had to guess, it probably had cubs nearby and was trying to scare me off. Still, I'll never forget the look of those teeth as they charged toward me.
I'm a female, and I worked at Chuck E. Cheese during my senior year of high school. Plenty of weird things happened in my time working there, but one was particularly creepy. I had already been working there for a while, and one night after school, I was working a 4 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. shift. My main job was usually to stand behind the counter and help any customers. Occasionally, I would clean stuff too, but for this night, I was mainly behind the counter. About an hour in, I remember some guy came up and started talking to me. He came off as a little too friendly and slightly creepy to me. I even wondered if he was drunk after a while based on the way he was talking. He told me he was there with his son and had given his son a bunch of tokens so he'd probably be there for a while. I was nice and friendly back to him at first, but after he talked to me for a good 5 minutes straight, it seemed a little weird. He also started to ask me more personal questions, and once I saw there was somebody in line behind him, I let the man know I needed to help the other customers. After this, he finally walked away, but he ended up coming back and trying to talk to me some more about an hour later. I didn't want anything to do with this guy and kind of tried to avoid him after that. When it was finally almost 9 p.m. and we were getting ready to close, I happened to notice that the man was still there. He was just sitting kind of near the exit, and he was all by himself. I realized he must have been there for at least 4 hours. He was looking at me, and I quickly looked away when we made awkward eye contact. There really wasn't anybody else there besides him, so it was really weird. I decided to go out into the arcade and see if anybody else was there at all. We closed in 5 minutes now, and I would have to let anybody still there know that we were closing and they would have to leave. When I went over there, though, nobody was in the arcade at all. I returned to the front desk after that and saw the guy still sitting there and looking at me again. I thought that he said he was there with his son, but I realized maybe he didn't have a son at all. It was a creepy thought, but I really just wanted the guy to leave. I saw one of my coworkers, Aaron, start to walk over to the man and say that we were now closing. I saw the man talk with Aaron for a second, and then he left, which was a huge relief for me to see that. After that, it was 9 p.m., and I would get off in just 30 minutes. I stayed after to clean a little bit, and did my usual cleaning of the arcade area, and then some of the dining areas. When 9:30 came, I was finally done, and I clocked out and left. I walked out the front door to the parking lot, which was practically empty. It was dark and quiet out there, but as I was approaching my car, I suddenly heard something behind me. It sounded like footsteps. I kept walking, but realized that they were fast approaching me. I turned around and saw a man walking extremely fast in my direction. Almost immediately, I recognized him as the man who was talking to me inside the Chuck E. Cheese. I ran for my car, and luckily I already had my keys in my hand. I was able to unlock my car and get inside before he reached me. As quickly as I could, I locked the doors, but the man reached my window a second later and then started knocking on it. He tried my door handle as well. I yelled at the man to go away, but he didn't listen. At this point, I really wanted to drive away, but the man seemed to be holding onto my door handle. I began honking the horn on my car repeatedly. This went on for probably 30 seconds straight, and finally I noticed a car on the road outside of the parking lot we were in start to slow down. They seemed to be wondering what was going on, and this caused the man to back away a little. As soon as he did, I sped off. I drove all the way home, and once I got home, I called my boss and told her all about it. I gave a description of the man and was told if I ever saw him again to call her. Luckily, I never did see him again. This story happened to me when I was a freshman in high school. It's still the scariest moment of my life. It was about a month into the school year, and it was a Friday. I remember that I was in my second hour class. It was math, and we had a test that day. I was pretty good at math back then, and I was able to finish the test pretty quickly. I felt good about it, and I saw that we still had 30 minutes of class left. I asked the teacher if I could go to my locker to put my math stuff away. She said yes, and I headed out the door. I was in no hurry to get back to class, knowing we wouldn't do anything the rest of the period, so I planned on taking my time going to my locker and back. I walked slowly to my locker, which was on the other end of school. The hallways were completely empty and quiet as I walked through them. I got to my locker and put my books back. I got some gum out of my locker and then started to head back to the classroom. Our school had 2 floors, and I remember that one of my best friends had a class right above the freshman lockers. I went upstairs to wave at him from the hallway, but when I got to his classroom, the door was shut and the lights were off. I figured the class must be in a computer lab or something. When I walked down the rest of the hallway, I noticed that all the classroom doors were shut and the lights were all off. I figured we must be having a lockdown drill. We usually had fire drills and lockdown drills early in the school year. I knew I wasn't supposed to be out in the halls during lockdown drills, so I started to walk back to my math class. After I got down the stairs, I heard footsteps. I didn't want to get in trouble, so I went under the stairs to hide. There was a little area underneath the stairs that was pretty open, but at the same time you couldn't really see from the halls. I saw it was a teacher walking down the halls. He was going pretty fast and had a concerned look on his face. He must have been looking for kids in the halls, is what I thought. He then went back up the stairs. What concerned me was that he actually started to run to go back up the stairs. The thought then occurred to me that maybe this lockdown wasn't a drill. I decided to keep going back to my classroom. I got to the sophomore locker commons, which were just in front of the math hall. But after I walked about 10 feet into the commons, I noticed a man standing in the middle of them with his back to me about 100 feet away. I didn't recognize him, and he wasn't dressed at all like a teacher or a staff member. He had longer hair and was wearing boots with dirty jeans and a black hoodie. He was just standing there looking at one of the lockers. I stood there unable to move for a second. I didn't know if he had heard me or not. I started to turn around to go back when the man punched the locker with his fist and then started to turn around. This stunned me, and I quickly hid behind a row of lockers next to me. He started to walk closer. I ducked down and held my breath. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I heard his footsteps get closer and closer. He then opened up a locker. He sounded to be about 2 rows over from me. I really didn't want to stay there for him to find me, and I made up my mind that I was going to make a run for it. I listened to make sure he was far enough away, but it suddenly got silent. It was silent for what felt like forever. I tried my best not to breathe or move a muscle. Finally, I heard his footsteps start again. They were getting closer. I couldn't take it anymore, and I got out from the lockers and took off running. I ran back the way I came and took a left which led to the front doors. I heard the man's footsteps start pounding on the floor behind me. I ran as fast as I could and didn't look back, all the while hearing him about 20 feet away. Finally, I got to the steps leading to the lunchroom and out to the front door. I sprinted to the front door to see a police car right outside. An officer saw me and the man chasing me and ran in the door and grabbed me, while another officer ran past. The man stopped chasing me and ran the other direction, but didn't make it far as he was caught. I ended up having to answer a lot of questions, but we all got out of school early that day. It turns out the man was on drugs and was trying to break into the lockers to steal things. My teacher and principal weren't even mad at me and were just happy that I was safe.
This story happened to me when I was in 3rd grade. I was about 8 years old at the time. My regular babysitter was ill, so my mom asked one of our neighbors who had kids and babysit a lot of the neighborhood kids if she would watch my brother and I for a few hours. We were having so much fun at Brandy's house when my mom came to pick us up. I asked if I could stay a little bit longer and finish Madagascar, as we had just started watching it. She said that it was fine, but I was to walk straight home right after. It was like maybe half a block, so not that far at all. So as the movie finishes, Brandy said that I needed to get home really fast because it was dark out. As I'm walking home, this other neighbor, Dennis, is just standing outside in his front yard. Now, I had seen Dennis around the neighborhood because his wife was very unforgettable looking. They have a daughter that was like maybe 4-ish at the time, so I didn't ever play with her or know her family outside of seeing them around the neighborhood. Dennis starts calling out to me, saying,
Hey, what are you doing?
I'm just going to my parents.
Do you want to come inside for a little bit?
No, that's okay. My mom told me to come straight home.
Aw, come on. I'm sure she wouldn't mind.
No thanks.
Come on. I have a daughter who would absolutely love to play with you. We can even make snacks.
At this point, I was just like, red flag, abort mission, and I started booking it home really fast. Then he starts following me. Not quickly, just kind of walking like Michael Myers. It was creepy. Luckily, I eventually made it home, and once he saw that I was approaching my house with my porch light on, he completely backed off. I'd like to mention that behind our houses was a giant wooded area with paths that led to a nearby lake. So, I mean, this dude could have caught me and dragged me into the woods or something. I try not to think like that, but like, what other motives could he have had, you know? Fast forward until I'm in high school and working at a restaurant in town. I see creepy Dennis and his wife all the time. As it turns out, they were secret shoppers at our restaurant. I don't think he really recognized me working there though. Anyways, I know this isn't your typical horror story of someone getting dragged into the woods, but still, as a child, this was a very creepy experience to go through. If you're a young child walking home alone, always watch your surroundings. You just never know.